Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Our story tonight will take us on the waves of the Atlantic Ocean and on some of the largest passenger ships ever built, ocean liners. We will relive the competition between lines and ships to be the fastest, the largest, the fanciest. I'll tell you about the experience of European migrants traveling to America, of wealthy tourists and businessmen crossing the ocean on these floating palaces. We will relive the stories of some of the most famous liners from the 20th century, like the Titanic and its starship, the Olympic, the Queen Mary, the SS Normandie, the SS United States, the Bremen, and the Rex. So let's begin right now with arguably the most famous of them all, even though it is for a tragic reason, the Titanic. I'm not going to retell the night of the sinking because you know the story and it is spectacular, but also sad. And also it could suggest that crossing the Atlantic in the 20th century on liners was something dangerous, when in reality it wasn't, at least during peacetime. Another large liner sank a few years later, the Lusitania, during the First World War, after it was attacked by submarines. But the disaster of the Titanic is one of the two big accidents that happened over thousands and thousands of crossings. The other one was a collision in 1914 between another liner, the Empress of Ireland, and a cargo ship at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in Canada. Other than that, liners were actually very safe statistically, and ironically, safety was one of the perceived advantages of the Titanic. This ship was not the first liner of its kind to be launched. She had a big sister, the Olympic, and the Olympic was already in operation when the Titanic made its first and last voyage. A third one, called the Britannic, was also commissioned. This family of ships is very telling about transatlantic travel at the beginning of the 20th century. The Olympic was launched in 1911 and the Titanic in 1912. They were owned and operated by a British company, the White Star Line, which comprised almost 30 ships in 1912. In the run-up to the First World War, traffic in the Atlantic, essentially between the USA and Western Europe, was growing fast in both directions. There were still migrants from European countries going to America, but with the development of tourism and economic connections between the two countries, many travelers crossed the ocean to visit or for business trips. We'll discuss this in more detail when we explore the history of ocean liners. This new clientele was sought after because they were wealthy travelers, industrialists, bankers, politicians, heirs, and their families. 70 to 80% of them were Americans who went to Europe to visit the old continent, meet their relatives, and stay for a few weeks or months before going back home. They had money to spend and wanted to enjoy the trip. It had to be fast, about a week at the beginning of the 20th century. So, shipping lines tried to attract them with new ships that were spectacular, luxurious, safe, and fast. Until the First World War, The market was dominated by British lines like White Star and Cunard, but increasingly they had to compete with German lines like Hamburg America or Norddeutsche Lloyd. White Star launched an ambitious project to replace its old liners, which dated from the previous century, with ships that would be larger and more comfortable than any before. This is why the Olympic class that included the Titanic was designed. They had to be more attractive than all older liners, larger, and they had to embody the kind of European luxury that wealthy Americans sought, and they would comprise the majority of the first-class clients. The competition to offer larger, faster, and fancier ships had begun earlier. In particular, in the first decade of the century, the main British competitor, Cunard, had launched two liners, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which were at the top of this game. But the Olympic and the Titanic were designed to outdo them. So the project started in 1907, and the two ships were built in Belfast, Northern Ireland. There were slight differences introduced to make the construction more economical or to improve performance. But overall, the three ships, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, looked very similar. Titanic was almost 900 feet long, about 270 meters, and her height above the waterline was 92 feet, or 28 meters, equivalent to a 10-story building. She had 10 decks, 10 floors, 8 of which were for passenger use. From top to bottom, the highest one was the boat deck, on which the lifeboats were housed. This sounds like an impractical choice. Why not have the lifeboats closer to the water? But it was because the ship needed to maneuver while docking, so the lifeboats had to be placed high above the platforms where passengers would embark and disembark. The decks reflected the hierarchy of classes. First-class cabins and restaurants, entrances, lounges, smoking rooms, libraries, and promenades dedicated to first-class passengers were on the top 4 decks, which also included a few amenities for second-class travelers, but it was all separated so that passengers of different classes would never mix. The one deck where passengers could be a bit closer to one another but still separated was the 5th one. It had dining saloons for first and second-class passengers, and a space accessible to third-class passengers. And then, still going down to the bottom, the 6th to 8th decks had cabins for second and third class. Every passenger deck was located above the waterline. Below it there were 2 more decks for cargo space, and at the very bottom, on the 10th deck, the inner bottom of the hull, a platform for the ship's boilers, engines, turbines, and electrical generators. Passengers could obviously not access this, but given the size of the ship, the inside was a maze of stairs between decks, of separations between classes, of long corridors that gave access to cabins and plenty of other rooms, kitchens, cabins for the crew, a swimming pool, Turkish bath, kennels for animals, a squash court, and a post office. There were communication systems between the bridge, on top of the ship from where it was piloted, and the engine rooms at the very bottom. The complexity of this liner was unequal because of its size. It could carry 3,300 people at once, 2,400 passengers, and 900 crew. Due to the slightly different design choices, the Titanic was marginally larger than the Olympic, and so when she was launched, it was the largest ocean liner in the world. It was an event, but not such an extraordinary novelty because its sister ship had been in operation for months when the Titanic made its first crossing. But for passengers, it was an extraordinary experience. Even first-class passengers did not travel that way often. They knew they would travel on one of the most spectacular machines ever built by man. Like a floating town propelled by giant engines that only battleships could compete with. A lot of thought had gone into the ship's design to maximize passenger comfort. For example, there were two kinds of engines on the Titanic. One turbine and two reciprocating engines, all powered by steam. Turbines provided more power, but they caused uncomfortable vibrations. This was a design problem that the big liners owned by Cunard had encountered with the Lusitania and the Mauretania. So in order to provide a smoother experience, the Titanic was equipped with only one turbine, the main engine that provided 40% of its power, and two slightly less powerful but more comfortable reciprocating engines. Each of them drove a propeller, so there were 3 propellers, and their combined power was expected to make the ships of this class some of the fastest, if not the fastest, on the Atlantic. The proportions of the engines were really impressive. Modern engines tend to be smaller, whereas these steam-powered engines required huge spaces and quantities of coal. The reciprocating engines were 63 feet long, that is 19 meters, and weighed more than 700 tons each. In the lower deck of the ship, there were 29 boilers to produce steam, and 159 furnaces to heat them. Each boiler could contain 48 tons of water, the equivalent of a small swimming pool. To power all of this, 600 tons of coal were required each day, and they had to be shoved into the furnaces by hand. So just making the engines work required the service of almost 200 firemen who worked around the clock, feeding the furnaces with coal. This produced 100 tons of ashes every day. So 30 to 40 meters under the feet of first-class passengers who were enjoying their journey in luminous and luxurious lounges or the comfort of their cabins. There was a totally different world of heat, metal, and dirt, where hundreds of mechanics and firemen worked relentlessly to keep the floating palace moving. And the liner was illuminated with electricity too, thousands of light bulbs. At the time, in 1912, electricity for lighting and other uses like communication was not uncommon. Many American and European towns already had electrical plants, but still, for many passengers, the abundance of artificial light was the first time they had seen anything like that in their lives. Oil or gas lamps were more common than electricity still. The electrical plant on the Titanic produced more power than an average city power station at the time. The ship also had auxiliary generators in the stern of the ship. After it hit the iceberg and started to sink, these secondary generators were activated, and this is why the ship stayed illuminated until the last few minutes before it sank. For additional security, the interiors of the ships of the Olympic class were subdivided into different compartments. There were 16 of them, and they could be sealed with watertight doors. The idea was that should one compartment be filled with water, it could still be isolated and not compromise the whole ship. This type of design works well for large ships, but it was still not enough to save the Titanic, because the breach to its hull was too extensive, beyond salvage. The liner also had 4 funnels, these big chimneys that all liners had. These funnels served practical purposes to evacuate smoke high enough to not inconvenience the passengers on the upper decks, but they also had an aesthetic purpose. They gave the liners a particular line, a silhouette, a visual signature. Actually, of the 4 funnels of the Titanic, only 3 were functional. The 4th one was mostly decorative, serving only to evacuate air from the kitchens. It was very oversized for that purpose. This visual signature of liners with high funnels lasted well after the age of coal, when liquid fuel replaced it. High chimneys became less necessary as there were still gases to expel, but no longer the kind of thick black smoke that comes from coal burning. But liners throughout the 20th century kept funnels because they were expected of them. They placed the ships in the prestigious lineage of previous transatlantic ships. They have disappeared on modern cruise ships mostly, which are the successors to these ocean liners, and we'll talk about this transition later. But for now, let's see what existed before the Titanic and the evolution of transatlantic journeys over time. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. If you join our Patreon, which is possible for as little as $3, £3, or €3 a month, you will gain access to more than a dozen exclusive stories. We add a new one every month, and you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. You also get advance releases on Fridays instead of Sundays, surveys, and obviously, this is the best way to let us know your feedback, requests, and wishes about Lights Out Library. So regardless what you can pitch in, everyone gets everything that is on our page. But before we begin, let's take a moment to prepare for our journey ahead. If you'd like, gently close your eyes and let your daily concerns drift away. Find a position that feels natural and cozy. Perhaps make small adjustments until you're perfectly comfortable. Now, draw in a deep breath, and as you release it slowly, notice how your body responds. Feel the warmth flowing from your shoulders down through your neck, melting away any tension. Let your facial muscles become soft, your jaw loose, your fingers naturally open, and your legs completely at ease. As you settle into this peaceful state, my voice will be your gentle companion as we begin our exploration together. And now let's return to ocean liners and explore the appearance and history of these giants of the seas. So, what was it like to travel between Europe and America several centuries ago? Of course, until the 19th century, all travels were made on sailing boats. And even though there was a flow of migrants in the 17th and 18th centuries, passenger traffic was not very intense yet. For most migrants, it was a one-way trip to America. The only people who made the round trip were soldiers, troops sent to the colonies and back, and a few administrators, explorers, or traders. There were small convoys of settlers on ships that either stayed in America or returned almost empty of passengers. This wasn't enough to establish commercial lines, and individual travelers would pay for their crossing on merchant ships. It was dangerous. Piracy in the Atlantic Ocean was a reality until the late 17th century. Ships could get lost in storms, and you could never precisely know when you would reach your destination. This started to change 200 years ago for a multitude of reasons. The United States and other countries in America had become independent, and they were growing very fast demographically and economically. Immigration from Europe to America reached another level. From tens of thousands annually, it became hundreds of thousands throughout the 19th century. So the flow of potential passengers was growing exponentially. Then the colonial powers in Europe, especially Great Britain, needed to put in place stable maritime routes to connect the different parts of their empire around the world. Until the 19th century, there was no accepted regulation of navigation. Each country did what they wanted or what they could. New concepts like international waters were put in place. A lot of international norms were started in this period. For example, maybe you have wondered what is the meaning of these letters, these prefixes in front of ships' names like RMS and SS. Liners generally come with letters SS, a prefix that means screw steamer. It is sometimes also translated as steamship, even though it is not 100% accurate. Because initially there were two prefixes for steamships, SS for screw steamer and PS for paddle steamer. But paddle steamers almost entirely disappeared, so only SS remained. Now the letters RMS that a lot of British liners used, RMS Titanic, RMS Olympic, RMS Queen Mary, they mean Royal Mail Service. This prefix means that they carried mail and had a contract with the British Royal Mail. Many ship lines like White Star, Cunard, and P&O liked to use this prefix because it was prestigious and suggested efficiency and punctuality. The use of these prefixes for civilian ships has become less visible nowadays, and there are no longer SS because even though large ships are still propelled with screws, they typically have internal combustion engines, not steam. And there is a prefix for that, MV, motor vessel, but it is rarely used. So returning to our story, as the governments wanted to have stable communication lines with their possessions or other countries around the world, they started to encourage the creation of passenger services. The first one on the Atlantic between England and the U.S. was established in 1818. It was called the Black Ball Line, and it connected Liverpool to New York City with medium-sized boats that could travel both on the ocean and in rivers. The first line was founded by a group of New York Quaker merchants, and it kept operating for 60 years. But sailing on the Atlantic was still rather slow and uncertain, even though most journeys ended well. The big change was due to the replacement of sails with steam engines. The very first ship working with a steam engine was built in 1807 during the Napoleonic Wars. It was slow and could only be used on short distances. Its maiden voyage was on the Hudson River between New York City and Albany, but it worked well enough to establish a regular service between the two cities. In 1816, the first crossing of the English Channel by a steamship was achieved, and a regular service was put in place between France and England. And a few years later, in 1819, the Atlantic was crossed for the first time by a steamship, the SS Savannah, that went from Savannah to Liverpool in 27 days. It was less impressive than it sounds because the ship also had sails, and the steam engine was only used for 4 days out of the 27. But still, the viability of a steamship on a large ocean was established. The problem with steam engines at the time was that they were way less efficient than they would become. They consumed too much coal for direct propulsion, because only a fraction of the power they produced could be put to use. Their efficiency was still very low. Another problem at the start was that there was no public enthusiasm for the technology. The idea of traveling with a boiler under pressure beneath your feet on an experimental ship was really unattractive. These ships were still made primarily of wood, and the thought of a boiler explosion was not reassuring. In fact, the SS Savannah was attracting no passengers. On the day of departure, 32 people had booked seats, and no one showed up. So its steam engine was removed, and it operated with sails for the rest of its career. It sounds a bit silly now, but at the time, and even influential writers were very skeptical that a steamship would ever be able to cross an ocean using a steam engine all the way, because the quantity of coal looked far too much for the ship to be able to transport its own fuel. But this was without taking into account technical improvements. New engines were designed that were more efficient in using steam, with condensers that fed the boilers with fresh water that was reused. That was a useful innovation because when seawater was used, it left salt in the boilers and they had to be regularly shut down and cleaned to remove it. In 1837, the first long-distance travel using steam power throughout was achieved on a journey from Liverpool to New York City. The first time it took 18 days, already a huge improvement over sailing ships that needed about a month. But they had miscalculated the quantity of coal for the crossing, and the crew had to burn cabin furniture to complete the voyage and establish this record. But from this moment on, the competition to cross the Atlantic as fast as possible began. And the tradition for the blue ribbon appeared. It was an unofficial recognition, an accolade attributed to the fastest boat to cross the Atlantic. The blue ribbon was not based on how long the crossing took, but the average speed, because there were different routes. The blue ribbon changed hands many times. It was British, American, French, German, Italian. The last holder of the title, technically still the holder, because no other new liners competed for it, is the SS United States that launched at the beginning of the 1950s. An important figure in the development of large steamships in the 19th century was an English engineer called Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He is credited with many inventions and technical improvements during the Industrial Revolution, especially in railways, but he also worked on ships. He realized that with the arrival of steam technology, it made sense, technically and financially, to build bigger and bigger boats. This is because the carrying capacity of a ship increases as the cube of its dimensions. If you double its length, height, and width, you multiply its capacity and volume by 8. It makes sense. But at the same time, the water resistance only increases as the square of its dimensions. Water resistance is what you have to overcome to make the ship move. So this means that, tendentially, the larger the ship, the more fuel efficient it can be. It didn't matter much when ships were powered by wind, which is free, but coal, or any other fossil fuel, is not, and has to be stored. The logical consequence was that large ships should be more efficient and more profitable. This was the strong rationale behind the creation of larger and larger liners during the age of steam. It is not just that they were more comfortable because they could offer more space and services to passengers, or that they were appealing because of their extraordinary size. They were also more efficient. As passenger services across the Atlantic were established and fully booked on their journeys from Europe to America due to the rise in migration, technical innovations continued. Paddle wheels on the first ships were replaced by propellers. Paddle wheels worked well on still waters, but on an ocean with waves, a propeller, or several, is more efficient to propel bigger and bigger ships. The hulls changed too. They transitioned from wood to metal so that they could carry the heavier and heavier machinery required. The race to giant boats had begun and would eventually lead up to the Titanic in 1912. Or even bigger, the SS Imperator in 1913, a German liner that had a capacity of 4,000 passengers. Before them, other milestones were the SS Great Eastern in 1858, another ship designed by Brunel. It remained the largest passenger ship in the world for more than 40 years. Until the 1890s, it could carry 4,000 passengers between England and Australia. The ship did not operate between Europe and America, so technically it was not a transatlantic liner. It had a complicated career, including an explosion during its maiden voyage, but it could reach Australia from England without stopping, with a combination of steam and wind propulsion. In the second half of the 19th century and the 1900s, competition on transatlantic routes raged between the two main British lines. White Star, the owner of the Titanic, and Cunard. There were also other competitors. The Compagnie Générale Transatlantic, better known as the French Line, and several German lines that established service between Hamburg or Bremen and America. They all tried to outdo the competition with faster, bigger, and more comfortable ships. And in all these aspects, new ships established new records. They were now entirely made of metal, and the last auxiliary sails were disappearing in favor of full steam propulsion. For example, in 1870, the White Star launched the RMS Oceanic, which offered electricity, large portholes, and running water to all its first-class passengers. In 1897, the German line Norddeutscher Lloyd launched the SS Kaiser Wilhelm the Grosse, which combined all the luxuries existing on all other ships plus engines that were powerful enough to steal the blue ribbon from the British ships that had retained it until this year. This liner was also the first to have 4 funnels, even though it really needed only 2. But more were added for the aesthetics and to give passengers a feeling of safety and power. To stay in the competition, other lines did the same and incorporated 4 funnels into their design. For 10 years, the blue riband remained in German hands. It had become perhaps too important at the expense of passenger comfort. Another liner, the SS Deutschland, designed to obtain the blue riband, did so with engines that generated very strong vibrations to the point of discomforting people on board. But the British kept responding, and they took back the accolade with new ships like the Lusitania and the Mauretania, launched by Cunard, and, a few years later, the Olympic class by White Star. At the same time, the French line introduced in 1912 another 4 funnels and 4 propellers liner that was not the largest, nor the fastest, but the fanciest, the SS France, and it was a commercial success. It became one of the most sought-after liners by the French and American public for the quality of food. An interior decoration that was reminiscent of the Palace of Versailles. The Germans were preparing their response to the last giant British liners, including the SS Imperator that I mentioned before, when the First World War started in 1914 and strongly disturbed transatlantic travel. Passenger traffic dropped. The blockers of Germany was put in place, and with front lines all over Europe, American tourism vanished. Some of the liners were converted temporarily into hospital ships like the Mauretania or the Britannic, the 3rd ship of the Olympic class. Others became troop transports or were converted to warships, even though they didn't have the kind of armor necessary to engage in battles against battleships or cruisers. The liners were privately owned, but they were seized or rented by the governments economically during the war due to the necessity of coordinating the war effort. The state became very interventionist, especially in Great Britain and in France, as opposed to their previous approach that stayed away of the private sector. It didn't really come as a surprise to anyone because in the years before the war, Shipbuilders worked at the same time for shipping companies and for the military, and plans had been made to use the entire national fleet in case of a conflict to participate in the war effort. During the war, many liners were lost. The Britannic, the younger sister of the Titanic, sank in the Aegean Sea after she struck a mine. The Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse was defeated and scuttled after a battle off the coast of West Africa. But the most famous accident remains the torpedoing and sinking of the RMS Lusitania by German submarines in 1915. At the time, the Lusitania was operating as a passenger ship. In theory, civilian passenger ships were supposed to be spared, but Germany was starting a policy of unrestricted warfare, and the sinking caused the death of more than 100 Americans, even though the USA had stayed neutral in the war. The news caused a lot of emotion in America, where at the time the public opinion was strongly against intervention in the war and in favor of neutrality. The sinking strongly pushed the U.S. in favor of Great Britain and France. The country only entered the war in 1917 on the side of the Allies, but before that it had already started to support them with funding and the sale of equipment. When the war ended, all large German liners that could still function were seized as war reparations, and they were operated by Allied powers. The First World War had completely changed the face of the world. European powers had started it wealthy and confident. They were the bankers of the world. They had colonies on every continent. And 4 years later, they were indebted. They had lost millions of men, and the seeds of independence in their colonies overseas had appeared. So nothing would ever be the same again. In the East, the empire of the Tsars had fallen to communism, and the USA was stronger than ever, but very hesitant, very reluctant to intervene. So a new world was appearing, and in the end of the 1920s, a period of economic euphoria following the devastation of the war was beginning. In this interwar period, the 1920s and 30s, a new age began for transatlantic liners. And with it came a new generation of ships that would push the limits, not on the technical limit, but in terms of luxury, service, and even size. Now that the conflict was over, shipping companies could resume their operations. But the economic aspect of transatlantic passenger lines had drastically changed. The first period of mass immigration to America was now really over. The decline had started before the First World War, when the USA had started to restrict new entrances. But in the 1920s and 30s, the flows of migrants became very limited. The U.S. restricted again their quotas of migrants drastically, and this source of income for lines vanished. So Europe lacked arms to work in its industry anyway, and European countries wanted to restore their demography. There were still travelers as business and leisure travel quickly returned to their pre-war level. But the problem that arose was that given the competition and expected level of service on ships, it had become very hard, if not impossible, to turn a profit in this industry. For reasons of prestige and due to externalities of having large liners, European governments still wanted to have passenger lines to America and large, impressive ships. By externalities, I mean spending by travelers that benefited the whole national economy, the jobs created or maintained, the know-how of shipyards, and the necessity to give them work to preserve a national naval capacity that was also useful for military reasons. So the government started to give subsidies to passenger lines and help fund new ships. They all had to do it to stay in the race because otherwise, the age of large liners, or at least the age of first-class travel, would have ended due to the lack of a profitable model. So in this new age of liners, competition between countries for prestige and to show their national genius and engineering capabilities tended to replace the competition between shipping lines that prevailed before, even though there was already an element of national pride in ocean liners before 1914. With the interwar period came a new generation of liners, like the British Queen Mary, the French Normandie, the German Bremen, and the Italian Rex. During this particular period, American lines had a hard time competing because the U.S. government was less inclined to give subsidies. Additionally, the U.S. shot themselves in the foot when it came to transatlantic travel due to prohibition. U.S. liners were considered an extension of U.S. territory, so the prohibition of alcohol extended to them, and it cost them a big chunk of the transatlantic market. Among prominent modern liners of the 1920s and 1930s, two were French. The Ile-de-France, launched in 1927, and even more notably the Normandie in 1935. The Ile-de-France was the first major ocean liner built after the First World War. While some ships that had been started or operated before the war, like the Mauretania, remained in service in the 1920s, but this was the first time a new liner appeared on the market. The age of the race to even bigger ships was mostly over for now, and the Ile-de-France had 3 funnels instead of 4. Its tonnage was 20% less than the Titanic, and it could accommodate only 1,800 passengers, far from the 4,000 that the last pre-war giant, like the German Imperator, could carry. However, the Ile-de-France was a commercial success due to the image it developed, particularly for its modern decoration. Pre-war liners and those in the early 1920s still featured decorations similar to those found on the Lusitania or the Titanic, embracing Victorian or Beaux-Arts styles. This meant a mixture of neoclassical, neo-Baroque, and neo-Gothic elements, with designs reminiscent of antiquity and 18th century styles, heavy sculptures and curved staircases. These interiors essentially translated the decorative schemes found in 19th century mansions and bourgeois apartments throughout Western Europe and American cities. The Ile-de-France, however, embraced the fashionable Art Deco, or modern style, which, while still ornate, featured straight lines, geometric patterns, and decorative motifs inspired by both geometry and ethnic designs. This fresh and unique approach appealed to wealthy, fashion-conscious travelers. American passengers particularly appreciated having a choice between American liners, which appeared somewhat outdated and operated under prohibition, and this new trendy vessel where they could socialize and travel along celebrities. Because the ships developed a reputation for being entertaining and glamorous throughout the 1920s and 1930s, attracting numerous international celebrities, including movie stars and singers, musicians and performers traveling across the Atlantic. European film stars like Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo journeyed to Hollywood, while American jazz musicians and performers such as Josephine Baker ventured to Europe. The Ile-de-France, more than other ships, embodied the festive and jubilant atmosphere of the 1920s, at least for the wealthy elite who could afford passage. Given its success and the French line's desire to establish a new, more impressive liner on Atlantic routes, they developed the more ambitious SS Normandie. Though the Normandie made its maiden voyage in 1935 and proved to be a commercial failure, particularly due to its launch during the Great Depression, it remains one of the most impressive liners ever built, combining exceptional performance and style. When the Normandie made its first crossing in 1935, it was the largest and fastest passenger ship afloat in the world. It could cross the Atlantic in a bit more than 4 days. You remember that sailboats needed a good month. The first steamships needed 2 weeks. At the time of the Titanic, it had dropped further to less than a week, and now 4 days. The age of coal was over for large ships. The Normandie had turbo-electric engines. She was still a steamship, but steam was produced by burning fuel oil, not gold. This is why she was still the SS Normandie, screw steamer. Her propulsion wasn't incredibly powerful, but her hull had been designed to be particularly efficient, and her lines were also very modern, giving hints at the transition of liners towards modern cruise ships that would happen many years later. Thanks to her modernism, she would capture the blue riband. What she remained famous for was her interior design and decoration. She was very spacious for passengers. The Normandie was 20% longer and heavier than the Titanic, but carried fewer passengers, only 2,000. She had the most lavish and expensive interiors ever made, all in Art Deco style, featuring contemporary French artists. The interiors were filled with grand perspectives, high roofs, big entryways, and long, wide staircases. It was very theatrical. The main dining room felt like a grand hall. The funnel uptakes had been split to pass along the sides of the ship rather than straight upwards, which left a lot of volume for interior rooms. The first-class dining hall was 300 feet long, 46 feet wide, and 28 feet high. The room could seat 700 people. And passengers entered through 20-foot-tall doors adorned with bronze medallions. Many first-class cabins were actually more like suites. The most luxurious ones had private dining rooms, multiple bedrooms, a piano, and a private deck. The list goes on. It was a grandiose ship, perhaps too much for its own good. The Normandie was very expensive to operate. Its construction took longer than expected, and for travelers, the lavish and impressive, bigger-than-life interiors made it a curiosity worth seeing, but not necessarily a place where one would want to stay. She was maybe too spectacular and intimidating to be fun and enjoyable. This liner probably reached the limit of the ever more luxury logic that had started in the 19th century, contributing to its commercial failure, of course combined with the Great Depression. When she started operating in 1935, the worst of the Great Depression was over, and the world economy had begun to stabilize. But the mood was no longer suited to something so eccentric and ostentatious. The Normandie operated at a financial deficit and could only remain viable through government subsidies to balance its accounts. However, the technical performance was impressive. It battled with the Queen Mary for the blue riband, and each ship took it alternately in the run-up to the Second World War. During the war, the Normandie was in New York City, and it was seized by U.S. authorities. In 1942, while being converted to a troop ship, she caught fire and capsized, coming to rest on the mud of the Hudson River. The interiors were lost to flames or water. She was salvaged, but it appeared after the war that restoration would be too costly, so the ship was scrapped in 1946. In the same period, late 1920s and 1930s, other European countries launched their generation liners too. In 1928, the Norddeutsche Line from Germany launched the SS Bremen and her sister ship, the SS Europa. The Bremen made her maiden voyage in July 1929. They couldn't know it, but obviously it was not the best timing. 3 months before Black Thursday, when Wall Street collapsed and a crisis that would become the Great Depression started. 6 years before the Normandie, the Bremen was the most advanced liner, with high-speed steam turbines. That is to say, steel steam propulsion, not a combustion engine, but powered with fuel oil. The Bremen was a return to heavy liners. She had the same tonnage as the Titanic, and it would be overtaken only several years later by the Normandie and then the Queen Mary. When they began operations, the ship was the most modern technically, and the Bremen easily captured the blue riband. She also had a luxurious first class and introduced a fourth class, the tourist class, between second and third in terms of price and space. She also had, for the first time, a small seaplane that could be catapulted from the ship with mail and land hours before the ship reached its destination. This was a way of accelerating mail delivery. To give you an idea about fuel consumption, she needed 33 tons of fuel per hour, about a small bathtub every minute. But with that, she could propel 3,000 people, 2,000 passengers, and 1,000 crew at a speed of 27 knots. That's about 50 kilometers per hour, or 31 miles per hour. For Germany, after the defeat in the First World War and the huge economic troubles in the 1920s, this was a symbol of industrial comeback, and the construction of the Bremen sparked new competition which pushed France to launch the Normandie, and the UK the Queen Mary. There was yet another country willing to enter the competition, Italy. Since 1922, Mussolini controlled the country and wanted to show off the capabilities of Italian industry and engineering. So a lot of care went into the design of another liner about the size of the Bremen, the SS Rex. She launched in 1931 and made her first voyage in 1932. At first, there were big technical difficulties, and the maiden voyage was a bit disastrous. The engines stopped working when the ship was approaching Gibraltar, and they even lost their electrical supply. But after repairs and improvements, the ship finally lived up to its promises and captured the Blue Riband, which it kept from 1933 to 1935. The Rex was another impressive floating palace with eccentric features. She had a classical decoration, which could look a bit dated, but there still was an audience for it. Apart from that, she was themed as the floating Riviera. For example, sand was scattered in the outdoor swimming pools, and they were surrounded with multicolored umbrellas to give them a beach-like effect. The Rex operated until Italy entered the Second World War, and she was sunk in bombing operations in 1944. And finally, there was yet another major and famous British ship that made its maiden voyage in 1936, the RMS Queen Mary. The two main British operators of liners, White Star and Cunard, went into big financial trouble in the 1930s, and they couldn't finish the ships they had under construction. So, under supervision and with the help of the government, they were merged into a single company, Cunard White Star. The new line could compete and start operating its new flagship, the Queen Mary, in 1936. She was followed by a sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, which was slightly larger, in 1938. They were a response to recent superliners like the Bremen, the Normandie, the Rex. The design was criticized at the time for being rather conservative. Her lines reminded one of pre-war liners, and her interior decoration had been modernized to Art Deco, which was now the new fashion, but it looked restrained in comparison with the French liner. It was less over the top, but it turned out to be a better commercial strategy because she was more affordable and not as intimidating in a context of economic depression. She was more marketable and proved more popular with passengers, which is why the Queen Mary had a good career. She was in operation as a liner from 1936 to 1940, then converted to a troop ship during the Second World War to transport soldiers. She returned to commercial service after the war until the 1960s. She took the Blue Riband in 1936, lost it to the Normandie in 1937, but took it back the following year and kept it for 14 years until the SS United States captured it in 1952. The Queen Mary still exists. After her last voyage in 1967, she sailed to California, Long Beach, and has remained moored there since then as a tourist attraction with restaurants, a museum, and a hotel. And again, With the arrival of war, transatlantic passenger lines were interrupted, and this time warfare in the Atlantic remained ferocious for several years. When service resumed after 1945, the world had changed again. Although liners were now faster than ever, able to cross the Atlantic in 3 to 4 days, their last days of domination in transatlantic travel was nearing. Turbojets that could connect Europe and America in a matter of hours multiplied in the 1950s. There was no way liners could compete with their speed and lower costs. However, there would still be new liners launched in this declining market, like the SS France, the RMS Queen Elizabeth II, the SS United States. The SS United States was probably the best liner constructed in the U.S. and the fastest of them all. It took the blue riband on its maiden voyage and still holds it today. She could be transformed into a troop ship for 15,000 troops, which was part of the reason for her construction. The U.S. Navy participated in its funding because she could become a strategic asset if needed. She made 400 crossings from 1952 to 1969. But like her competitors, she could not turn a profit in the 1960s, which led to her retirement. This ship still exists today. She is currently in Philadelphia and has been awaiting possible transformation or renovation for 50 years. Another of the last liners was the SS France, launched in 1960. Also a national project made more for prestige and potential benefits than direct profitability. The ship was subsidized throughout its entire career. At more than 1,000 feet long, it was an attempt to recreate the achievement of the Normandie, but with an offering better suited to the market and times. There were only two classes: first class, which represented 25% of cabins, and tourist class for the rest. The France had already announced the transition of ocean liners to cruise ships. So what is the difference between the two? Technically, they are all large passenger ships. However, an ocean liner is primarily designed to transport passengers from point A to point B, while a cruise ship is built for the purpose of taking passengers on a journey. Cruise ships are pure tourism vessels, and even though the journey may include visits outside the ship, the vessel itself is the main attraction. This means a different design approach is needed. Cruise ships must offer extensive entertainment options, from show venues to clubs, casinos, and stores. An ocean liner could always be converted into a cruise ship, but its original design could limit its capacity. Nevertheless, the France increasingly became a ship people sailed on for the cruise experience itself, rather than simply crossing the Atlantic. When its losses were amplified by the oil crisis of the 1970s due to the rising fuel costs, it was sold to a Norwegian cruise company and renamed the Norway. This was considered a minor national tragedy in France at the time because it symbolized the end of an era for such national prestige projects. As the Norway, she operated successfully as a cruise ship until the 1980s. Since then, cruise ships have completely overtaken and replaced ocean liners. The age of these glorious ships that dominated transatlantic routes for a century finally came to an end. Today, only one ocean liner remains in service worldwide, the Queen Mary II. She operates between Southampton, England, and New York City, but also serves as a cruise ship for part of the year, since the transatlantic market alone would be insufficient. She carries a few thousand people across the Atlantic, representing a tiny fraction of passenger traffic between Europe and America, while millions fly across the ocean every year. So this is the end of our journey for tonight, and I hope you liked this introduction to ocean liners. Now you can let go and sleep, or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.